Section 5 of Reminiscences of Captain Gronow. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ruth Golding. Reminiscences of Captain Gronow by Captain Rhys Howell Gronow. Section 5. The late Duke of Richmond. One of the most intimate friends of the Duke of Wellington was the Earl of March, afterwards Duke of Richmond. He was a genuine hard-working soldier, a man of extraordinary courage, and one who was ever found ready to gain laurels amidst the greatest dangers. When the 7th Fusiliers crossed the Bidassoa, the late Duke left the staff and joined the regiment in which he had a company. At Orthez, in the thick of the fight, he received a shot which passed through his lungs. From this severe wound he recovered sufficiently to be able to join the Duke of Wellington, to whom he was exceedingly useful at the Battle of Waterloo. On his return to England he united himself to the most remarkably beautiful girl of the day, the eldest daughter of Lord Anglesey, and whose mother was the lovely Duchess of Argyle. The unfortunate charge of the Household Brigade. When Lord Uxbridge gave orders to Sir W. Ponsonby and Lord Edward Somerset to charge the enemy, our cavalry advanced with the greatest bravery, cut through everything in their way, and gallantly attacked whole regiments of infantry. But eventually they came upon a masked battery of 20 guns, which carried death and destruction through our ranks, and our poor fellows were obliged to give way. The French cavalry followed on their retreat, when perhaps the severest hand-to-hand cavalry fighting took place within the memory of man. The Duke of Wellington was perfectly furious that this arm had been engaged without his orders, and lost not a moment in sending them to the rear, where they remained during the rest of the day. This disaster gave the French cavalry an opportunity of annoying and insulting us, and compelled the artillerymen to seek shelter in our squares. And if the French had been provided with tackle or harness of any description, our guns would have been taken. It is, therefore, not to be wondered at that the Duke should have expressed himself in no measured terms about the cavalry movements referred to. I recollect that, when his Grace was in our square, our soldiers were so mortified at seeing the French deliberately walking their horses between our regiment and those regiments to our right and left, that they shouted, "Where are our cavalry? Why don't they come and pitch into those French fellows?" The Duke of Wellington's opinion of the French cavalry. A day or two after our arrival in Paris from Waterloo, Colonel Felton Hervey having entered the dining-room with the dispatches which had come from London, the Duke asked, "What news have you, Hervey?" Upon which Colonel Felton Hervey answered, "I observe by the Gazette that the Prince Regent has made himself Captain General of the Life Guards and Blues for their brilliant conduct at Waterloo." "Ah," replied the Duke, "His Royal Highness is our sovereign, and can do what he pleases. But this I will say, the cavalry of other European armies have won victories for their generals, but mine have invariably got me into scrapes. It is true that they have always fought gallantly and bravely, and have generally got themselves out of their difficulties by sheer pluck." The justice of this observation has since been confirmed by the charge at Balaclava, where our cavalry undauntedly rushed into the face of death under the command of that intrepid officer, Lord Cardigan. Marshal Excelmann's opinion of the British cavalry. Experience has taught me that there is nothing more valuable than the opinions of intelligent foreigners on the military and naval excellencies, and the failures, of our united service. Marshal Excelmann's opinion about the British cavalry struck me as remarkably instructive. He used to say, "Your horses are the finest in the world, and your men ride better than any continental soldiers. With such materials, the English cavalry ought to have done more than has ever been accomplished by them on the field of battle. The great deficiency is in your officers, who have nothing to recommend them but their dash and sitting well in their saddles. Indeed, as far as my experience goes, your English generals have never understood the use of cavalry. They have undoubtedly frequently misapplied that important arm of a grand army, and have never, up to the Battle of Waterloo, employed the mounted soldier at the proper time and in the proper place. The British cavalry officer seems to be impressed with the conviction that he can dash and ride over everything, as if the art of war were precisely the same as that of fox hunting. I need not remind you of the charge of your 2 heavy brigades at Waterloo. This charge was utterly useless, and all the world knows they came upon a masked battery, which obliged a retreat, and entirely disconcerted Wellington's plans during the rest of the day. Permit me," he added, "to point out a gross error as regards the dress of your cavalry. I have seen prisoners so tightly habited that it was impossible for them to use their sabres with facility." The French marshal concluded by observing, "I should wish nothing better than such material as your men and horses are made of, since with generals who wield cavalry, and officers who are thoroughly acquainted with that duty in the field, I do not hesitate to say I might gain a battle." Such was the opinion of a man of cool judgment, and one of the most experienced cavalry officers of the day. Appearance of Paris when the Allies entered. I propose giving my own impression of the aspect of Paris and its vicinity when our regiment entered that city on the 25th of June, 1815. I recollect we marched from the plain of St. Denis, my battalion being about 500 strong, the survivors of the heroic fight of the 18th of June. We approached near enough to be within fire of the batteries of Montmartre, and bivouacked for 3 weeks in the Bois de Boulogne. That now beautiful garden was at the period to which I refer a wild pathless wood, swampy and entirely neglected. The Prussians, who were in bivouac near us, amused themselves by doing as much damage as they could, without any useful aim or object. They cut down the finest trees, and set the wood on fire at several points. There were about 3,000 of the Guards then encamped in the wood, and I should think about 10,000 Prussians. Our camp was not remarkable for its courtesy towards them. In fact, our intercourse was confined to the most ordinary demands of duty, as allies in an enemy's country. I believe I was one of the first of the British army who penetrated into the heart of Paris after Waterloo. I entered by the Porte Maillot, and passed the Arc de Triomphe, which was then building. In those days the Champs-Elysées only contained a few scattered houses, and the roads and pathways were ankle deep in mud. The only attempt at lighting was the suspension of a few lamps on cords, which crossed the roads. Here I found the Scotch regiments bivouacking. Their peculiar uniform created a considerable sensation amongst the Parisian women, who did not hesitate to declare that the want of culottes was most indecent. I passed through the camp, and proceeded on towards the gardens of the Tuileries. This ancient palace of the kings of France presented, so far as the old front is concerned, the same aspect that it does at the present day; but there were then no flower gardens, although the same stately rows of trees which now ornament the grounds were then in their midsummer verdure. Being in uniform, I created an immense amount of curiosity amongst the Parisians, who, by the way, I fancied regarded me with no loving looks. The first house I entered was a café in the garden of the Tuileries, called Le Gax. I there met a man who told me he was by descent an Englishman, though he had been born in Paris, and had never really quitted France. He approached me, saying, "Sir, I am delighted to see an English officer in Paris, and you are the first I have yet met with." he talked about the Battle of Waterloo, and gave me some useful directions concerning restaurants and cafes. Along the boulevards were handsome houses, isolated, with gardens interspersed, and the roads were bordered on both sides with stately spreading trees, some of them probably 100 years old. There was but an imperfect pavement, the stepping stones of which were adapted to display the Parisian female ankle and boot in all their calculated coquetry, and the road showed nothing but Mother Earth, in the middle of which a dirty gutter served to convey the impurities of the city to the river. The people in the streets appeared sulky and stupefied. Here and there I noticed groups of the higher classes, evidently discussing the events of the moment. How strange humanity would look in our day in the costume of the First Empire! The ladies wore very scanty and short skirts, which left little or no waist. Their bonnets were of exaggerated proportions, and protruded at least a foot from their faces, and they generally carried a fan. The men wore blue or black coats, which were baggily made, and reached down to their ankles. Their hats were enormously large, and spread out at the top. I dined the first day of my entrance into Paris at the Café Anglais, on the Boulevard des Italiens, where I found, to my surprise, several of my brother officers. I recollect the charge for the dinner was about 1/3 what it would be at the present day. I had a potage, fish, anything but fresh, and, according to English predilections and taste, of course I ordered a beefsteak and pommes de terre. The wine, I thought, was sour. The dinner cost about 2 francs. The theatres at this time, as may easily be imagined, were not very well attended. I recollect going to the Français, where I saw for the first time the famous Talma. There was but a scanty audience; in fact, all the best places in the house were empty. It may easily be imagined that, at a moment like this, most of those who had a stake in the country were pondering over the great and real drama that was then taking place. Napoleon had fled to Rochefort, the wreck of his army had retreated beyond the Loire, no list of killed and wounded had appeared, and, strange to say, the official journal of Paris had made out that the great imperial army at Waterloo had gained a victory. There were, nevertheless, hundreds of people in Paris who knew to the contrary, and many were already aware that they had lost relations and friends in the great battle. Louis XVIII. Arrived, as well as I can remember, at the Tuileries on the 26th of July, 1815, and his reception by the Parisians was a singular illustration of the versatile character of the French nation, and the sudden and often inexplicable changes which take place in the feeling of the populace. When the Bourbon, in his old lumbering state carriage, drove down the boulevards, accompanied by the Garde du Corps, the people in the streets and at the windows displayed the wildest joy, enthusiastically shouting "Vive le Roi!" amidst the waving of hats and handkerchiefs, while white sheets or white rags were made to do the duty of a Bourbon banner. The king was dressed in a blue coat with a red collar, and wore also a white waistcoat and a cocked hat with a white cockade in it. His portly and good-natured appearance seemed to be appreciated by the crowd, whom he saluted with a benevolent smile. I should here mention that 2 great devotees of the Church sat opposite to the king on this memorable occasion. The cortège proceeded slowly down the Rue de la Paix until the Tuileries were reached, where a company of the Guards, together with a certain number of the Garde Nationale of Paris, was stationed. It fell to my lot to be on duty the day after, when the Duke of Wellington and Lord Castlereagh arrived to pay their respects to the restored monarch. I happened to be in the Salle des Maréchaux when these illustrious personages passed through that magnificent apartment. The respect paid to the Duke of Wellington on this occasion may be easily imagined, from the fact that a number of ladies of the highest rank, and of course partisans of the legitimate dynasty, formed an avenue through which the hero of Waterloo passed, exchanging with them courteous recognitions. The king was waiting in the grand reception apartment to receive the great British captain. The interview, I have every reason to believe, was not confined to the courtesies of the palace. The position of the duke was a difficult one. In the first place, he had to curb the vindictive vandalism of Blucher and his army, who would have levelled the city of Paris to the ground if they could have done so. On the other hand, he had to practise a considerable amount of diplomacy towards the newly restored king. At the same time, the duke's powers from his own government were necessarily limited. A spirit of vindictiveness pervaded the restored court against Napoleon and his adherents, which the duke constantly endeavoured to modify. I must not forget to give an illustration of this state of feeling. It was actually proposed by Talleyrand, Fouché, and some important ecclesiastics of the ultra-royalist party to arrest and shoot the Emperor Napoleon, who was then at Rochefort. So anxious were they to commit this criminal, inhuman, and cowardly act on an illustrious fallen enemy who had made the arms of France glorious throughout Europe, that they suggested to the Duke, who had the command of the old wooden-armed semaphores, to employ the telegraph to order what I should have designated by no other name than the assassination of the Caesar of modern history. Marshal Ney and Wellington. As an illustration of the false impressions which are always disseminated concerning public men, I must record the following fact. The Duke of Wellington was accused of being implicated in the military murder of Ney. Now, so far from this being the truth, I know positively that the Duke of Wellington used every endeavour to prevent this national disgrace; but the Church party, ever crafty and ever ready to profit by the weakness and passions of humanity, supported the king in his moments of excited revenge. It is a lamentable fact, but no less historical truth, that the Roman Catholic Church has ever sought to make the graves of its enemies the foundations of its power. The Duke of Wellington was never able to approach the king or use his influence to save Marshal Ney's life, but everything he could do was done in order to accomplish his benevolent views. I repeat, the influence of the ultramontane party triumphed over the Christian humanity of the illustrious Duke. The Palais Royal after the Restoration. France has often been called the centre of European fashion and gaiety, and the Palais Royal, at the period to which I refer, might be called the very heart of French dissipation. It was a theatre in which all the great actors of fashion of all nations met to play their parts. On this spot were congregated daily an immense multitude, for no other purpose than to watch the busy comedy of real life that animated the corridors, gardens, and saloons of that vast building, which was founded by Richelieu and Mazarin and modified by Philippe Égalité. Mingled together, and moving about the area of this oblong square block of buildings, might be seen, about 7 o'clock P.M., a crowd of English, Russian, Prussian, Austrian, and other officers of the allied armies, together with countless foreigners from all parts of the world. Here, too, might have been seen the present King of Prussia, with his father and brother, the late king, the Dukes of Nassau, Baden, and a host of continental princes, who entered familiarly into the amusements of ordinary mortals, dining incog at the most renowned restaurants, and flirting with painted female frailty. A description of one of the houses of the Palais Royal will serve to portray the whole of this French pandemonium. On the ground floor is a jeweller's shop, where may be purchased diamonds, pearls, emeralds, and every description of female ornament, such as only can be possessed by those who have very large sums of money at their command. It was here that the successful gambler often deposited a portion of his winnings, and took away some costly article of jewellery, which he presented to some female friend who had never appeared with him at the altar of marriage. Beside this shop was a staircase, generally very dirty, which communicated with the floors above. Immediately over the shop was a café, at the counter of which presided a lady, generally of more than ordinary female attractions, who was very much décolletée, and wore an amount of jewellery which would have made the eye of an Israelite twinkle with delight. And there la crème de la crème of male society used to meet, sip their ice and drink their cup of mocha, whilst holding long conversations almost exclusively about gambling and women. Men's thoughts in this region seemed to centre night and day upon the tapis vert, and at the entrance of this salon was that fatal chamber, over which might have been written the famous line of Dante, Voi che entrate, lasciate ogni speranza. The reader will at once understand that I am referring to the gambling house, the so-called hell of modern society. In one room was the rouge et noir table, which, from the hour of 12 in the morning, was surrounded by men in every stage of the gambling malady. There was the young pigeon, who, on losing his first feather, had experienced an exciting sensation, which, if followed by a bit of good luck, gave him a confidence that the parasites around him, in order to flatter his vanity, would call pluck. There were others, in a more advanced stage of the fever, who had long since lost the greater part of their incomes, having mortgaged their property, and been in too frequent correspondence with the Jews. These men had not got to the last stage of gambling despair, but they were so far advanced on the road to perdition that their days were clouded by perpetual anxiety, which reproduced itself in their very dreams. The gambler who has thus far advanced in his career lives in an inferno of his own creation. The charms of society, the beauty of woman, the attractions of the fine arts, and even the enjoyment of a good dinner, are to him rather a source of irritation than delight. The confirmed gamester is doing nothing less than perpetually digging a grave for his own happiness. The third and most numerous group of men round the tapis vert consisted of a class, most of whom had already spent their fortunes, exhausted their health, and lost their position in society, by the fatal and demoralising thirst for gold which still fascinated them. These became the hawks of the gambling table. Their quick and wild-glancing eyes were constantly looking out for suitable game during the day, and leaving it where it might be bagged at night. Both at the rouge et noir table and roulette the same sort of company might be met with. These gambling houses were the very fountains of immorality. They gathered together under the most seductive circumstances the swindler and the swindled. There were tables for all classes. The workman might play with 20 sous, or the gentleman with 10,000 francs. The law did not prevent any class from indulging in a vice that assisted to fill the coffers of the municipality of Paris. The floor over the gambling house was occupied by unmarried women. I will not attempt to picture some of the saddest evils of the society of large cities, but I may add that these Phrynes lived in a style of splendour which can only be accounted for by the fact of their participating in the easily earned gains of the gambling house regime. Such was the state of the Palais Royal under Louis XVIII and Charles X. The Palais Royal of the present day is simply a tame and legitimately commercial mart, compared with that of olden times. Society has changed. Government no longer patronises such nests of immorality, and though vice may exist to the same extent, it assumes another garb, and does not appear in the open streets as at the period to which I have referred. At that time, the Palais Royal was externally the only well-lighted place in Paris. It was the rendezvous of all idlers, and especially of that particular class of ladies who lay out their attractions for the public at large. These were to be seen at all hours in full dress, their bare necks ornamented with mock diamonds and pearls, and thus decked out in all their finery, they paraded up and down, casting their eyes significantly on every side. Some strange stories are told in connection with the gambling houses of the Palais Royal. An officer of the Grenadier Guards came to Paris on leave of absence, took apartments here, and never left it until his time of absence had expired. On his arrival in London, one of his friends inquired whether this was true, to which he replied, "Of course it is, for I found everything I wanted there, both for body and mind." The English in Paris after the restoration of the Bourbons. There is no more ordinary illusion belonging to humanity than that which enables us to discover, in the fashions of the day, an elegance and comeliness of dress which a few years after we ourselves regard as odious caricatures of costume. Thousands of oddly dressed English flocked to Paris immediately after the war. I remember that the burden of one of the popular songs of the day was "All the world's in Paris," and our countrymen and women, having so long been excluded from French modes, had adopted fashions of their own quite as remarkable and eccentric as those of the Parisians, and much less graceful. British beauties were dressed in long straight pelisses of various colours. The body of the dress was never of the same colour as the skirt, and the bonnet was of the beehive shape and very small. The characteristic of the dress of the gentleman was a coat of light blue or snuff colour, with brass buttons, the tail reaching nearly to the heels. A gigantic bunch of seals dangled from his fob, whilst his pantaloons were short and tight at the knees, and a spacious waistcoat with a voluminous muslin cravat and a frilled shirt completed the toilette. The dress of the British military, in its stiff and formal ugliness, was equally cumbrous and ludicrous. Lady Oxford, that beautiful and accomplished woman who lived in her hotel in the Rue de Clichy, gave charming soirees, at which were gathered the elite of Paris society. Among these were Edward Montagu, Charles Standish, Hervey Aston, Arthur Upton, Kangaroo Cook, Benjamin Constant, Dupin, Casimir Perier, as well as the chief Orleanists. On one occasion I recollect seeing there George Canning and the celebrated Madame de Stael. Cornwall, the eldest son of the Bishop of Worcester, had from some unaccountable cause a misunderstanding with Madame de Stael, who appeared very excited, and said to Lady Oxford in a loud voice, "Notre ami, Monsieur Cornouaille, est grosso, rosso et furioso." It should be observed that the gentleman thus characterized was red-haired and hasty in temper. All who heard this denunciation were astounded at the lady's manner, for she looked daggers at the object of her sarcasm. Fox, the secretary of the embassy, was an excellent man, but odd, indolent, and careless in the extreme. He was seldom seen in the daytime, unless it was either at the embassy in a state of negligee or in bed. At night he used to go to the Salon des Étrangers, and if he possessed a Napoleon, it was sure to be thrown away at hazard or rouge et noir. On one occasion, however, fortune favoured him in a most extraordinary manner. The late Henry Baring having recommended him to take the dice-box, Fox replied, "I will do so for the last time, for all my money is thrown away upon this infernal table." Fox staked all he had in his pockets. He threw in 11 times, breaking the bank, and taking home for his share 60,000 francs. After this, several days passed without any tidings being heard of him; but upon my calling at the embassy to get my passport vised, I went into his room, and saw it filled with cashmere shawls, silk, Chantilly veils, bonnets, gloves, shoes, and other articles of ladies' dress. On my asking the purpose of all this millinery, Fox replied in a good-natured way, "Why, my dear Gronow, it was the only means to prevent those rascals at the salon winning back my money." Les Anglaises pour rire. An order had been given to the managers of all the theatres in Paris to admit a certain number of soldiers of the army of occupation free of expense. It happened that a party of the Guards, composed of a sergeant and a few men, went to the Théâtre des Variétés on the Boulevards, where one of the pieces, entitled Les Anglaises pour rire, was admirably acted by Potier and Brunet. In this piece English women were represented in a very ridiculous light by those accomplished performers. This gave great offence to our soldiers, and the sergeant and his men determined to put a stop to the acting. Accordingly, they stormed the stage, and laid violent hands upon the actors, eventually driving them off. The police were called in, and foolishly wanted to take our men to prison, but they soon found, to their cost, that they had to deal with unmanageable opponents, for the whole posse of gendarmes were charged and driven out of the theatre. A crowd assembled on the boulevards, which, however, soon dispersed, when it became known that English soldiers were determined, coûte qu'il coûte, to prevent their countrywomen from being ridiculed. It must be remembered that the only revenge which the Parisians were able to take upon the conquerors was to ridicule them, and the English generally took it in good humour, and laughed at the extravagant drollery of the burlesque. The English soldiers generally walked about Paris in parties of a dozen, and were quiet and well behaved. They usually gathered every day on the Boulevard du Temple, where they were amused with the mountebanks and jugglers there assembled. This part of Paris is now completely changed, but at the time I speak of, it was an extensive open place, where every species of fun was carried on, as at fairs. There were gambling, rope dancing, wild beasts and shows, booths for the sale of cakes, gingerbread, fruit, and lemonade, and every species of attraction that pleases the multitude. But that space has now been built upon, and these sports have all migrated to the barriers. During the time our troops remained, we had only one man found dead in the streets. It was said that he had been murdered, but of that there was considerable doubt, for no signs of violence were found. This was strongly in contrast to what happened to the Prussian soldiers. It was asserted, and indeed proved beyond a doubt, that numbers of them were assassinated, and in some parts of France it was not unusual to find in the morning, in deep wells or cellars, several bodies of soldiers of that nation who had been killed during the night, so strong was the hatred borne against them by the French. Section 5. Recording by Ruth Golding.